Cohen, the Chief Economist for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all here today. I'm thrilled to introduce you to my colleague and friend, Mary Moore Hamrick. Mary Moore serves as a senior fellow with the Kenan Institute, as well as CEO of Political Quotient Advisors. She previously served as Chief Public Policy Officer for Grant Thornton and has spent more than 30 years working on Capitol Hill. Mary Moore is particularly well equipped to handle the partisan divide, given she holds a JD MBA from UNC and her undergraduate degree from Duke. Mary Moore, I won't ask you who you're going to root for, who you root for in basketball games. Today, we'll be discussing the Biden administration's legislative priorities and their policy implications with a particular eye toward the impact on business. And Mary, as always, Mary Moore, this is all from a apolitical perspective, just straight facts down the middle. We'll then spend the last few minutes or so fielding your questions. We welcome you to submit them at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, Mary Moore.
Thanks, Gerald. I'm so pleased to be here. I hope to educate, enlighten, and entertain our listeners today, but in an effort for bipartisanship, I ask that everybody sort of put your perspectives aside and try to listen to this and really learn something and see it from both sides and have a different point of view. So looking forward to it, Gerald.
Great. Mary Morris, we've got a lot to cover in the next hour, so let's jump right in. President Joe Biden promised Build Back Better on the campaign trail, and we've heard a lot about that initiative lately.
Well, I'll tell you, it was interesting. Joe Biden really laid out 4 key things, get COVID under control, get the pandemic and virus under control, Build Back Better, which is really from a broad perspective of infrastructure, climate change, national security, American competitiveness, and certainly achieve racial justice, which is a lens that he looks through on really all of his policies. And I think finally in his acceptance speech he spoke about the time to heal in America and the importance of returning to normalcy, to bipartisanship, where he wanted to be a healer in chief and restore America's global leadership. So those are the 4 key tenets that I sort of look at the Biden administration and his goals through, those 4 key priorities.
So what are President Biden's legislative priorities? And tell me about the 4 dimensions in this political chess game that is evolving.
Well, these are the 4 things that Senator Mark Warner actually outlined, speaking well for the entire Biden administration, talking about on television. The first 2 things really, when they came back from Labor Day, was they need to fund the government and raise the debt ceiling. That's sort of keeping the lights on and keeping the trains running on time. And then secondly, there was the policy initiatives of the infrastructure bill, and then social spending and increasing taxes to pay for them. So those are really the 4 key things that the Biden administration and Congress were looking at to get through to the end of last year.
So we've managed to extend the debt ceiling into 2023. I'm glad that happened, and fund their government until mid-February. So what's in store for 2022?
Well, as you can see, the Congress was successful in doing some very important things, and that's really just keeping the lights on and funding the government, which is going to run until next month, February 18th. It's going to be a problem, and they're going to have to figure out, do they pass a budget? President Biden typically would introduce a budget and submit that to Congress in February for the following year, but we really haven't had a budget for last year. So that's going to come back up. The debt ceiling has certainly been raised until early 2023, but we're staring at a couple of really important things. We've got the Build Back Better Act talks that were halted at the end of last month. And I think everybody really feels the fact that we're staring into a third year of COVID on March 14th. I always sort of pick that date because I think a Friday the 13th is the date that things shut down. And then we'll get towards the end, we'll talk a little foreshadowing of what we might learn in May when we have the first Georgia governor GOP primary that'll tell us a lot going into midterms. So that's kind of what I see looking out as some important dates going forward.
So Mary Moore, what is the 2020 presidential election, which we would have been resolved or wouldn't still have implications, but what does it tell us about Biden's ability to maneuver?
Well, it's really, I like to remind people that we have a really closely divided country. While Biden certainly won the popular vote and the electoral college, 48.6% of the country did not vote for him, and it was really more of a vote against President Trump. And the margins that we will look at in our upcoming slides, they really reflect this divided country. And so that makes it really challenging when one is trying to legislate and having bringing their policies to bear in a new administration. It's a tough road.
It is, and we all imagined that when the Democrats won control of the White House, the House, and the Senate, they would be able to kind of run the table. But it seems much more of a challenge to reach agreement on the key legislative priorities you've been discussing or you're mentioning.
Well, you're absolutely right, Gerald. And when you look at this screen, you can see that Speaker Pelosi cannot lose any more than 3 votes and control the House. I mean, just think about it, Gerald. Employers can easily have 3 people not show up on a day because they've got COVID or they're sick or whatnot. So she's got to hold everybody and can only afford to lose 3. And Majority Leader Schumer, he has to hold everybody, and he still doesn't have a majority. He's got to bring in Vice President Kamala Harris to break the tie. So this is a really challenging environment that these 2 leaders are operating within, and you can't underestimate these paper thin margins. They're really, really tight, Gerald.
So speaking of paper thin margins, the Senate is particularly thin. And there's been so much focus on Democratic Senators Manchin and Sinema. Why do they have so much influence?
Well, they have a lot of influence because in this world where every vote counts, this just shows you that in the Senate, normally everything takes 60 votes to happen on regular order, what I call regular order, which is your ending debate in order to move forward to a vote. So truly, on a normal day, Chuck Schumer has to hold all 50 Democrats and garner 10 Republican votes in the Senate just to move forward on a vote. That's why there's been so much focus on budget reconciliation, which is a once-a-year opportunity to pass a bill through the Budget Act on a party line vote, bringing in Kamala Harris, the vice president, to break the tie. And so when you have to hold everybody, every senator can be a king or a queen because you need their votes in order to move forward. So it truly is an uphill battle in the Senate. And that's why it's really tough to do major legislation and to get agreement.
So while the House isn't as paper thin, the margin, it almost seems like it's as thin or even worse because of the disagreements between the progressives and the moderates within the Democratic Party. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I mean, it's really fascinating. I mean, if you look at this chart, even there's the progressives and the moderates have, pretty even numbers. And then there's 16 individuals within those who claim to be both progressive and moderate. They're a member of both the New Democratic Caucus, which I've dubbed the moderates, and the Progressive Caucus. So you really have a lot of complexities within the Democratic Party. You certainly saw that earlier with Republicans. There's complexity even within the Republican Party, but because the Democrats are in control, this is what Speaker Pelosi has to maneuver and bring consensus, and that's what she's working with. That's what more people focus on.
And in terms of those disagreements between the progressives and the moderates, what exactly is going on that front?
Well, it's really important to remember that President Biden defeated Bernie Sanders, progressive Bernie Sanders, to win the nomination, and he had to get the progressive support to back him in the presidential election. And as you can see from this quote, Bernie Sanders really wants to move the agenda in the direction of being the most progressive president since FDR. Now, this is a high bar to reach, because you're asking President Biden to be very progressive, forward-thinking, and very bold in his policies when he really doesn't have the margins. And so you continue to have this split that's going on behind the scenes between the progressives and the New Democrats. New Democrats have even begun advertising themselves as normal Democrats. So you can see this party squabble, which really is herbal Tea Party squabble is what I call it. It really is the mirror reflection of what the Republicans went through with their Tea Party squabbles back in 2011. But the center of gravity in each party has truly just moved more to the flanks. The parties have become much more self-absorbed. You see that there's much impatience in the progressive wing of the party with the more moderate senators, Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, even though Manchin has a 60% job approval rating in West Virginia. And it was very interesting. Former Chairman John Dingell, before he passed, was quoted in the Wall Street Journal as saying that when he came to Congress, you represented your state or district first, and then you represented your party second. And unfortunately, that's been reversed. And that's true, but that's not a good thing for moving legislation in the country forward.
So given that kind of political backdrop, President Biden, let's kind of turn to how they're actually trying to implement policy. So one of President Biden's campaign promises was to get COVID-19 under control. How has the Omicron variant complicated that situation?
Well, the Omicron variant certainly has complicated a situation which created massive spending in order to try to defeat this virus going back almost 2 years ago. It's important to kind of look at the road that we have come in our pandemic spending, beginning back in March of 2020. I was amazed that 2 weeks after the world seemed to shut down, that the Congress came together on a 96-0 Senate vote and really unanimous consent on the House floor. You know, we've rarely, it's hard to remember that there was no negative vote against the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act when we had the 2.3 trillion being pushed out the door in order to give loans and grants to businesses large and small, and to send money to households and giving some unemployment relief. We then came together in December that year. It was really a bipartisan effort of senators that came back and said, you know, we need almost $1 trillion more. And if you think about it, we're layered. This is some major spending, but it was what was conceived as needed. Now, when we came back in December, I would say that was pretty. That was a pretty partisan vote. It was 92-6 in the Senate and 359 yes votes in the House. So that moved forward. the disconnect in the tree, and where there became more of a difference of opinion, and you actually heard this within the Democratic Party, there were some concerns, and while Joe Manchin voted for it, it was a party line vote of 1.9 trillion of the American Rescue Plan, which was a combination of more economic stimulus. And this is where you were hearing former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, who served under Clinton, and he also served under President Obama for the National Economic Council, warn of inflation. And so that's where we've had some challenges and some issues. So I think it's just important to sort of understand the spending and the progression and the challenges that one has when one comes with such really, really bold policies. It was interesting. NPR's Maura Liaison said that she'd never seen a president have such bold policies coming into office with such paper-thin margins. She was speaking to the Public Affairs Council. So it just outlines the challenges that President Biden has going in with a very bold policy.
So one of the, as you discussed, trying to kind of get bipartisan support, and this goes to actually one of the questions that we're seeing in the chat, President Biden did take a bipartisan approach to infrastructure. Can you tell us about the bill, and also kind of did the passage of the bill cost so much in political capital that it is hampering the president's other efforts?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, this is something that that the 19 Republicans voted with all 50 Democrats, and there's a lot of really great things in this bill. And President Biden, it's interesting on the political capital. I think that he actually could take more of a victory layup over the infrastructure bill, but the political capital came in when the House Democrats tied the vote to the Build Back Better Act. And because of a lot of back and forth, and all the country heard for a while, there was the Senate early on voted for infrastructure, but the House was delaying it to make sure that they got a vote on the Build Back Better Act. And I think that the back and forth over tying those two together is what really cost President Biden some political capital. I think he earned some in working within his party on and with the Republicans working together on this, and really could claim victory on things in the climate change space. You see electric vehicles and water infrastructure, and certainly broadband, expanding that to rural areas is a very, very popular thing, on top of the basic roads and bridges and rails and freight improvements that you see. This bill really layered $550 billion in new spending on top of the baseline. So this was a really vibrant, major package that President Biden, frankly, hasn't gotten enough credit for.
So you mentioned the Build Back Better Act, both in terms of the implications of infrastructure on that bill, and then also at the beginning in terms of the political challenges. So what do you think is politically feasible, especially in light of Senator Manchin's cutting off negotiations? Is there some way of moving forward? Big bill, small bill, medium size? What do you think the president can actually achieve?
Well, this is almost a problem of like, everybody can't have everything funded for what they want forever. It's like you have a limited budget, and you got to decide on your vacation and what are you going to have and where you're going to go. And you got all your kids wanting to do different things, and everybody wants to do it for the entire time. And so that's really kind of what President Biden is faced with. And the Democrats have to decide. Typically, if you're going to pass this on budget reconciliation, you've got a 10-year window, and you have so much money you can raise in taxes, which they have, but those taxes will not pay for 10 years of all the programs that you see up there. And so the hard choices that Democrats have to come to. And I wrote about this in a piece with Jeffrey Hoops several months ago for the Kenan Institute. They have to decide what are the programs that they got to pick and choose, and they got to fund them for 10 years to get Joe Manchin's vote. Now, maybe they can talk him off of that, but my recommendations would be for them to really focus and find what do they think is one really good, start with finding one really good social program and one really good climate change program that President Biden and the Democrats can claim victory, because they really need a win on this going into the midterms. So I would just say, they've got to come together on that, and people have to realize that you can't do it all at once, and that maybe they can do a few things well, claim victory, and move forward. I do think there's a high possibility that they do it because, as we'll see later, Democrats are facing a lot of challenges. People do want to return to normalcy, and they want them to pass something.
So I appreciate, as an economist, I very much appreciate the acknowledgement of trade-offs, although I think sometimes I don't understand the political trades-offs, but I do have a good sense of the economic trade-offs. So Mary Moore, one of the questions as an economist that we keep having is that we keep coming so close to the debt limit, and that we're constantly playing this dangerous game. And as an economist, say, well, we've already spent the money, so why can't we just agree that once we spend it, we're going to increase the debt limit? Why do we keep playing this game? And is there a way to avoid having these last minute showdowns that seem to, and sometimes shutdowns that just seem to kind of look bad for our economic system and our political, and kind of from foreigners from a political standpoint?
Gerald, you're absolutely right. I mean, this last time we've been playing the game is Congress under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Back in August of 2011, they kicked the can down the road until 2021. They started then, and they didn't agree to raise the debt ceiling. They just said, we're going to postpone a decision on that. They effectively just said, we're postponing that. We're going to ignore that. We're going to ignore our credit card for 10 years. And that's sort of what they did. And the reality is that no one wants to tell people to eat their spinach, that you have to either raise your taxes more or stop spending. And so everybody feels like that's political nightmare. And then the question becomes, will the electorate, are they concerned about it? Will they hold members accountable? And unfortunately, the U.S. credit card it's getting pretty heavy. That bill is getting pretty high. And you look over at our annual spending just for fiscal 21, CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is telling us that we have spent almost $7 trillion. And when I started in Washington 30 years ago, and you looked at this pie, mandatory spending was only about a third of the pie. And mandatory spending really is your Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those things that you're going to have spending on whether Congress acts or not. And discretionary spending, the yellow portion of the pie, has shrunk from being usually 2/3 of the pie to 24% of the pie. And that discretionary spending, that's defense, that's education, that's research, that's the National Endowment for the Arts, that's all the other stuff other than Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And our interest on the debt has been a smaller slice of that pie in the low interest rate environment. But that has ticked up as we've had more debt, and it'll be interesting to see where does that 6% go in this inflationary environment, with actions that the Fed might take that could raise interest rates. Was certainly something that we can talk about, but our spending really is out of control.
So as you said, Mary Moore, it's interesting, and something that I've noted to people who say, we should stop spending. It's that the discretionary part is such a small share of the pie, and it kind of relative to GDP, it's think it's at one of the lowest levels since the 1950s. So it kind of shows where we need to go in terms of how we cut, or if we need to just pay for it. And as somebody who actually likes their spinach, I think it's important to acknowledge that. But even with the strong economic growth, so the economy has had some spinach, Omicron notwithstanding. So hopefully this will be a relatively short-lived slowdown, for Omicron-related slowdown. The federal government is expected to run a very large deficit in 2022. Why is this the case, and what does it tell us about our long-term fiscal health, something which you started to address in the previous slide?
Yeah, I mean, our federal debt that's in the hands of the public is now 100% of our GDP, and it's been that way, hovering around that for a while. And I don't know, it's interesting to see that. I don't know if your average citizen isn't exactly worried about the federal debt every day when they're trying to put food on the table or get to work, but it really is an overall fiscal problem for us. You can see our spending really has ticked up since 2016, which means that we've had the current administration and the last administration started having deficits closer to $1 trillion. And last year we were at 3 trillion. This year we're close to 3 trillion. But prior to 2016, those deficits were in the billions, in the 500, 400 billion category range. So certainly the last 2 years of dealing with the pandemic and the stimulus around that, we've seen an explosion. So it is an issue. It's going to have to be addressed one way or the other at some point. But you can see these are the current projections now. I'm not sure our spending, the March bill, the March stimulus bill, the COVID stimulus package, CBO said added 1.1 trillion to our deficit. So the question is going to be that's why there's so much pressure on the Build Back Better Act from Senators Manchin and others who are concerned with the deficit, to not have that, to lower the cost, which started at 3.5 trillion, to lower that cost in the under 2 trillion, and even lowering it under 2 trillion. The question is, how are they going to pay for it? So this just underscores the overall difficulty of dealing with the policy that people want to advance, but not finding ways to pay for it.
So you mentioned, so the deficit and debt is one of the reasons why Build Back Better has been there's concern about Build Back Better. The other one is inflation. So what do we think? What are the implications?
Well, you can certainly see that the inflation from this chart, inflation has gotten to be the highest it's ever been in 3 or 4 decades. And basically what Larry Summers and Jason Furman, who was in the Obama administration, warned of is when we added further stimulus in that last bill of the US government pouring billions, the package was in the trillions, but you pour billions into the hands of consumers who are sitting at home, not able to spend in the ways that they did. And you pour all that into individuals and businesses' hands, you're going to have a boom. And that spending pattern for the US increased by 12%. And so as a result, it's your basic economic supply and demand. We didn't have the supply to meet this demand. Now, yesterday's CNBC poll just showed what we all know when we go to the grocery store or the gas pump. 84% of those polled, Republicans and Democrats alike, said, we're seeing higher prices than we saw a year ago. And the interesting thing about this inflation is Democrats typically look at employment through the lens of unemployment, of helping people to lower that number, which is a very good thing. But from a political calculation, the percentage of people who were helped by lower unemployment, which certainly has happened and been a very positive, that impacts a smaller percentage of the population. Inflation impacts 100% of the population because the purchasing power for everybody goes up. So I think that that's part of the challenge that President Biden is dealing with. And Gerald, you certainly have an excellent background from your economist point of view. What's your perspective on inflation, and can you share what you think that this impact is going to be?
Sure. So I think there's a very open debate, and I will just plug an upcoming insight that we're going to be putting out at the Kenan Institute, where we're kind of going to raise this debate about whether the U.S. economy is so overheated and we're at risk of continued acceleration of inflation versus if this is more transitory or temporary, where because of shifts in demand towards goods and supply chain issues, or factories not being able to produce as much because of COVID concerns, and then just slowing the lines because having to give people more time or more space, and then supply chain concerns related to the chip shortage, and so whether this has been kind of a confluence of events that's causing a wave that is likely to crest, or whether this wave is going to lead to a pickup in inflation, kind of there's so much demand and so limited supply, and that's going to take a very long time to work out, and people are going to shift their expectations towards higher inflation and people's wage demands. So two things. One is we've actually asked these questions in a report we put out yesterday, kind of 5 questions for 2022 for business people, and we're going to address the inflation and labor market questions specifically in this upcoming insight. I think it's a very open debate. I wish I had a crystal ball, or that my crystal ball wasn't foggy and that I could tell you what the outcome is. But from an economic standpoint and from a policy standpoint, I think it's a really, really challenging problem, because if you think this inflation is permanent, you, as Senator Manchin and as kind of you were mentioning, Mayor Moore, you need to slow this economy down. The Fed needs to tighten immediately. If you think that it's a temporary issue, then doing these kind of long-term investments in the economy and giving people, and the end of the child care or child tax credit, which ended at the end of last year, is going to be harmful for the economy. And so really there are two, and I hate to sound like a two-handed economist, they're really like kind of two very different policy paths that are sitting in the background, and we don't, and if we knew the answer to this question, I think we could point to and say this is the right policy to pursue, but we don't. And so I think it's just important to raise the issues and hope that we can lay out a set of signposts to say, look, if this continues, it's the transitory. If this happens, it's permanent. And so you need to take these policies. So I'm sorry not to be unable to answer your question, but at least we're trying to, raise the two different strands and say, how do we move forward?
That's terrific. Well, I look forward to hearing your and staying tuned to all of your good research and conversation.
Thank you, Mary Moore. So while this inflation is going up, as you mentioned, President Biden's approval rating has dropped in the summer. And according to the latest CNBC poll, which you mentioned from the inflation standpoint, it continues to fall. What do you think beyond inflation is contributing to this drop, and why is it so important?
Well, it's really interesting. You can see that President Biden came into office with a pretty high approval rating as presidents go when we look at things. But it was August where the lines crossed and he really went underwater, where his disapproval numbers became greater than approve. Back in July, COVID cases really started to surge. We had the Delta variant. We now have the Omicron variant. And in July, a lot of people think that approval rating fell to 50%. Then in August, we certainly had scenes of the Afghan withdrawal, and whether you agreed with the timing or not, it didn't matter which station or flavor or channel you looked on. The images of the U.S. military planes trying to take off from Kabul with people hanging onto the planes certainly did not help President Biden's approval rating. If you look further to the Gallup numbers, and then I'm going to refer to the CNBC numbers, the real key is within his own party. President Biden had been above 90%, according to Gallup, with the Democrats until December. He was above 90% from January to November, but that number dropped to 78% amongst the party in December. The CNBC poll, which I find coming from CNBC, is certainly a warning sign. Joe Biden's approval rating has dropped. His disapproval has reached 56%. And then when you break it down, it's the economy, which is the top issue for nearly every demographic, age, gender, whatever. And 60% of the respondents to the CNBC poll disapproved of Biden's handling of the economy. That's a 6% decline from September. We talked about inflation, and 84% of them said that they thought that the goods are higher, cost of goods are higher, and only 19% say they've perceived that they report more earnings. So there really is kind of a disconnect between Biden's ability to garner credit for the economy. We had one of the best stock markets we've ever had. The S&P finished up almost 27%. Unemployment's down to 4.2% from 6.3%, and average hourly earnings are up to 4.8%. So President Biden and the Democratic Party are struggling to convince voters that things are really better than they were 12 months ago. So that's the disconnect that's showing up in both the Gallup and the CNBC polls for President Biden. And Congress's approval rating has dropped as well. It's never been really high, but it's dropped in tandem with President Biden's.
So these numbers don't bode well for the midterms for the Democrats. What issues do you think what are the key issues kind of in terms of that are going to affect the midterms?
Well, we've certainly touched on a number of them. And I always go back to James Carville, who said it's the economy stupid. And I think that no matter what, the economy is always, an indicator, although it's really strange. You look at the economy but for inflation, you would think, as we said, we think that President Biden would be doing well, but even the Democrats, they're very tough graders. In that CNBC survey, they give President Biden a C on healthcare costs and rising wages, and they only give him a B on the economy overall. So these are the issues going into the midterms. I think that inflation really comes out of COVID. They're tied together. Everybody has experienced the supply chain, and I call it the everything shortage. If you're ordering a sofa, think about how long it takes to seem to get that thing over here. And a very interesting Wall Street Journal article looked at the ports and the infrastructure problems in the supply chain. COVID just really laid bare the infrastructure inefficiencies that we have. And we talked about that 12% demand. What that means is there's just a logjam of all those cargoes of freight coming over from China to Los Angeles and all these other borders. And we really have a port and intraland infrastructure challenge. We've got longer transit times, longer times to offload. We've long had trucker shortages of drivers, and the cost of carriers are going up because you have a lot of new environmental requirements on your emissions. And so as a result, you got many truckers who are just driving slower. So you have those issues, and everyone is feeling the back to work issues of, do I work from home? You've got the challenges. This bridges over to COVID. I think that we're really feeling it today with the Omicron variant. You've got, all we have to do is look at the long lines at the grocery store to see the shortage of workers, and people feel it going to restaurants that can't have those short order cooks, and people looking at planes where flights are canceled. So I think that these are the things that people just really are feeling fatigue. I call it COVID fatigue. I mean, as we go into the third year, people are just feeling frustrated and fatigued, and we were talking about a return to normalcy from trying to get away from tweets, and now we're talking a return to normalcy, and people really don't know what that looks like in the back to work, healthcare. What does that do with the shortages? One area where I think I'll just touch on, you've got the border crisis, which is certainly a challenge. I think after COVID and the economy, I think you're going to see some challenges with the border crisis, feeling that has not been addressed quite as well. And then crime is a very interesting one. If you look to those images of the smash and grab incidents in LA and San Francisco, in Nordstrom's and Louis Vuitton and whatnot, you had a number of prosecutors and city officials who veered left on policing and enforcement, and campaigned on defunding the police following George Floyd's murder. I think it's really interesting to look to Congressman James Clyburn. He reflected at the time of George Floyd's funeral that he felt that the defund the police campaigning or slogan really was not helping the Democratic Party. And he cautioned Democrats against the use of slogans like that. And he said it was cutting the throat of the party. He said that Democrats are for policing, they're just against horrible, rotten, in his words, we're against rotten police officers. So, the question is will that, you've got a new mayor, Eric Adams, in New York, who was a former police official, an African-American, who was actually putting more police units back on the streets. And it's going to be interesting to see which model that Democrats go with. The bottom line on midterms is it's 10 months away. It is a long time away. It's a political lifetime. We don't know what could happen with the unknowns, be it wars or weather or whatever. And will inflation subside? Will something positive happen on Build Back Better and the climate? And can Democrats take control of the PR and the marketing to get the credit that could be very well be due in those areas? So it's going to be interesting, but there are a lot of moving targets in this, Gerald, and we'll see what happens.
So Mary Moore, I was going to ask a question about the Virginia governor's race, but somebody actually and New Jersey, but somebody who's going to put a really nice question, frame my question a bit better than I would have. So I'll ask it from the chat, the Q&A. Do you believe the Virginia governor's election is simply a data point or far more significant of a predictor for midterm elections and even possibly extrapolated as a referendum on the executive branch?
Oh, that is an excellent question. I think that both Republicans and Democrats ignore the Virginia race at their peril. You have to remember that Virginia, you also though take Virginia though, it's more of a purple state, and so it's lessons learned in states. Virginia's really trended certainly much more blue than red in recent years, and so the fact that Glenn Youngkin with the endorsement of Trump, he navigated that by just being a proactive, positive person who had solutions, who the voters had viewed as having solutions to the challenges that they were looking at. I think that former Governor McAuliffe, the polling showed that he certainly had some overhang from the Biden administration. And there was a fascinating, Brian Stryker of ALGI Research, which is a Democratic focus group, they interviewed, and these were focus groups, they're not polling, but it was a Democratic effort to look at what was happening in Virginia around the time of that election. And they actually spoke with swing voters who voted for Biden, but were considering actively both the Republican and the Democratic candidates. And their determination was that the Democratic brand had left them very vulnerable, and that voters were unhappy with the direction of the country. Voters did not feel like their representatives, that the Democrats were listening to it. They said they didn't think the Democratic Party got it. And they said they felt the economy was bad, which is certainly showing up in the polling. They felt that Democrats focused more on social issues and not the economy. And I think the true quote that I loved is that they thought that the Democrats were doing nothing but fighting when the people in this focus group who voted for Biden really just wanted action on the economy. So I'm just not sure if going big and splitting the party is helping, and what is it that will help, and lessons learned. But I think that the other thing to watch is going to be the gubernatorial race, the primary, the Republican primary down in Georgia that's going to happen in May, where you have Governor Brian Kemp, who was blamed by Trump for certifying the election, who is being challenged by former Republican Senator David Perdue with the Trump endorsement. And that's a race that I think we can discuss in the future that's coming up, which will certainly tell us the direction of where the Republican Party might be going. But, you know, you learn from these things, and you all mix it into the overall pot of stew, and you see where it comes out come November. So we'll have a lot to talk about between now and then. But there were a lot of lessons learned here, and I'm sure that people are really stepping back and considering what are the takeaways from this and what changes can we make.
Thanks, Mary Moore. So as an economist, I like kind of these tables that lay out the kind of pros or the economic issues and the political issues. And so I think this scorecard that you've created is a really nice one. And so if you look at the economic issues in the stock market and even consumer confidence, they all look really good. And then inflation, as we discussed, is a negative, but we still have these, the president has these weak approval ratings. So what does this tell us? And what does this tell us for, you know, for policies ahead?
Well, it's really interesting. People, you know, if you looked at this, if you go back, as I said, if you go back to the James Carville, it's the economy stupid. If I were looking at this and we covered up the approval disapproval rating, I would think that the numbers would be flipped, because your market, the markets are up, unemployment is down, consumer confidence is at a pretty good level. the approval, disapproval tells you that there's something else going on out there. And you really, when you have the polling that you have, even within your own party, the question becomes, heading into the midterms, what are Democrats going to do? It's very interesting. Charlie Cook, who I respect very much, who is a political prognosticator in Washington, has said that there really isn't a lot that he thinks that Democrats can do other than hope that there is more controversy created by former President Donald Trump coming on the scene and generating some more anxiety on that side. And who's to say where that would come out? But it's very interesting to hear that. And I've not seen a disconnect and a scorecard like this before, but there is definitely, we need some good PR firms or marketing firms to go and help President Biden figure out how to claim credit for more numbers. And I don't know if it's because he's going too big or what, and the fighting, the infighting that we see within the party.
So Mary Moore, we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I had a question, but I'll about what could worry President Biden outside of what you've discussed. But let me ask this question, one question for the audience, and hopefully we can potentially get to a second. So the question is, I'm curious to know what you believe the private sector should be doing, but isn't, to drive solutions to some of the issues you're touching on today.
Well, that is a great question, because that's something we think about every day here at the Kenan Institute. Given our mission, we like to say, how do we leverage the private sector for the public good? And one thing that I would truly love to see is, could we focus more on these bipartisan solutions like the infrastructure bill? And can we get the best and the brightest from the private sector to work with the academic community and the research and policymakers? I think that I would encourage Congress to really hold more hearings and bring some of these private sector individuals in to hear what they have to say as you look at whether it be the environment. We're going to really need the collaboration of what can business do to help the public good. What are we hearing from the public on what their needs are, and how can the policymakers work to collaborate to bring whatever legislation or regulation or encouragement together. So frankly, as a country, this is a time where we really need to come together and leverage the best and the brightest from all of us. And so that's why I'm enjoying being a part of the Kenan Institute. And I'm hoping that we can get the private sector and the policymakers to listen to one another.
Well, Mary Moore, it's great to have you. I'm going to try to sneak in one last question, which was about mandatory spending, which we've kind of touched on. Is there, and kind of related to your answer about leveraging the private sector, is there a way to, how do we deal with mandatory spending, aspect of spending that's just likely to rise, or mostly because of healthcare, Medicare, and also Social Security? What do you think how can we politically get everybody on board to understand that this is really such a major long-term issue?
Well, it's really been interesting to me that with the increased demand for spending for COVID and social programs, we haven't paid a lot of attention to when the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Funds run out. And those numbers are not too many years out on the horizon. And so you really have different age constituencies and needs. And again, I think that this is going to come to a head. And what you really have to do is this is where this collaboration, it's healthcare costs that are truly driving things. So I know that the Kenan Flagler Business School is looking at it, as well as the Kenan Institute, the business of healthcare. We really have to find ways to really address how we come together to keep the quality up at the lowest cost and continue to make advances. So it really is a challenge. It needs everybody to focus on it. And this is where we need a nonpartisan, all hands on deck people to come together. So I thank everyone who's listened today and tried to learn something from the other side or the other point of view, because we can learn from one another.
Thank you so much, Mary Moore. I look forward to continue this conversation in the not too distant future. And please feel free to look on our website, contact Mary Moore. Her contact information was on the slides, and also you can find her on at the Kenan Institute, as one of our fellows. So please we look forward to doing this again soon, and watch out for future analysis from us. And again, happy and healthy New Year to everybody.
Thank you.